welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast platform. It helps others to find us. And feel free also to send us questions and suggestions. Also, we're looking for sponsors to fund a marketing initiative to help us reach a wider audience. The future is rushing towards us, and the better informed we all are, the better it will be. The launch of GPT-4 on the 14th of March has provoked concerns and searching questions, and nowhere more so than in the education sector. Earlier this month, the share price of US edutech company Chegg halved when its CEO admitted that GPT technology was a threat to its business model. Looking ahead, GPT models seem to put flesh on the bones of the idea that all students could one day have a personal tutor as effective as Aristotle, who was, of course, Alexander the Great's personal tutor. When that happens, students should leave school and university far, far better educated than we did. Donald Clark is the ideal person to discuss this with. He founded Epic Group in 1983 and made it the UK's largest provider of bespoke online education services before selling it in 2005. He's now the CEO of an AI learning company called WildFire and an investor in and board member of several other education technology businesses. In 2020, he published a book called Artificial Intelligence for Learning. Donald, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you, Callum. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Donald.
Donald, in your book, you joked that education is a bit of a slow learner. Do you think that GPT-4 and similar models will speed it up?
Well, it will undoubtedly change it, and change it radically. People say that about all technologies, of course, and education, both in schools and higher education, seems curiously immune to the charms of technology. It tends to have its own inertia, its own praxis and practice. But this is slightly different. I've been around in the technology game for a long, long time, all my adult life, 40 years. And this is a unique moment because this technology isn't about education. This technology is about the future of the species. That's not an exaggeration. It's not rhetoric to think that for the first time in the history of our species, we have a technology that both amazes and frightens us simultaneously. But to bring this back to education, which was what your question was about, Callum, I think this is radical in the sense, for the first time I have in my mind's eye on the horizon, not immediately, the idea in a sense of a universal teacher that's available online, something that really can replace teaching. Most online learning attempts so far have been adjuncts to teaching. It's very difficult to imagine doing it wholly on your own. Although, to be honest, in higher education, that is possible. You can do a complete online degree. It's perfectly feasible and happens. The online university have been doing this since 1969. People forget. Hundreds of thousands of students. But what I see on the horizon, this notion of a universal teacher is interesting because if you use even GPT-3, which was before 4, it was launched in November the 30th, 22, already you could see that this, in a mind-blowing sort of way, had a degree in almost every subject. It had this sort of pan-sophist idea of a universal knowledge inside it. Why is that? Because it does. It's literally culled or been trained on the data, which is the sum total of human cultural capital as captured in language. So when we use it or look into the ChatGPT world, we're looking at the history of our species, our sum total of knowledge. Now, no individual teacher can possibly have that. So on the horizon, then, I'm working on some projects in this area where you can imagine a service online, which is a teacher in any subject, at any level, available 24/7, 365 days a year, that never gets angry, accusative, is endlessly perfect in a way, and that embodies all the good pedagogic techniques that learning science provide us. Now, this is actually not true of the traditional education system. Learning styles, for example, we know that they literally don't exist and that it's a bit of bogus theory, but they're almost still universally present in the minds of teachers in most schools and certainly in universities. You can still go on university websites and find references to learning styles. So when I say education was a slow learner, your quote there, I think it takes a long, long time for really good pedagogy in the science of learning to climb inside the system.
When you talk about learning styles, do you mean the idea, which, as you say, has been debunked, that some people learn better visually and other people learn better audibly and other people kinetically?
Yes, well, some years back, Professor Pofield, a Scots Glaswegian guy, he actually wrote a government report on this and showed that there were a total of 71 theories of learning styles. He rattled them down to 13. Most of the rest were complete hokum, of course. But even in those 13, you had the VAC system, which you've just referred to, this visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which was by far the most common one adopted in schools. But you had other forms of learning styles that were adopted in workplace learning, the Honey and Mumford model. And so, but they were all basically fundamentally wrong. They're all trying to distill these essences. These differences don't actually exist cognitively. Well, it's not quite true to say that absolutely, actually. But there are two things. One, the last thing you should be doing for a child who is a kinesthetic learner is let him dance his way through life as opposed to reading or an auditory learning. I don't even know what an auditory learner means. What, they listen to podcasts all the time or something? Or a visual learner just watches pictures or television? It was so crude and so ridiculous. There was no research behind this, of course. It was an armchair theory by a New Zealand teacher. But many things in education have been faddish over the years. That's one. There have been many others, like whole word teaching, the idea that you teach not phonetically, but by simply getting kids to read whole words. This was catastrophic and went on for nearly 2 generations in our schools. So this notion of a universal teacher that embodies good teaching, pedagogy, the contemporary science of learning. Your question was about the speed of learning. I think this certainly can speed up learning. You know, Bloom's known for his Bloom's taxonomy, which is ancient, useless piece of hierarchical pyramid. Bloom never had a pyramid, actually, in any of his writings. But what's interesting about another piece of research that Bloom was obsessed by is time to competence. In other words, everybody has a different time to competence. We all take different speeds because we have different pre-existing knowledge and so on. Here we have a chance through AI to apply a terribly important word, and that's personalization. So I've worked on these systems, and they're hugely successful. It's basically a one-to-one tutor. Let's not imagine this is anything new. Most parents with any money at all tend to hire tutors for their kids on the side, pretend they didn't, but of course they do on a massive scale. Teachers are constantly telling me that you can only teach in a classroom 1 to 30 group collaborative learning and then make all their money on the side by tutoring in the evenings. Of course, we know, and that's another piece of research, that, interestingly by Bloom, that this really does work one-to-one tutoring because you're personalising and you're going at the speed at which the learner needs to learn. Now, these systems are very much like that. When you use ChatGPT, it's a highly personalised experience. You've asked it a question, and as you rightly said, like Aristotle, or more pertinently perhaps Socrates, they would come back with an answer. Not necessarily an answer. Good teaching is not about giving you the answer. Good teaching is about prompting you forward in a dialogue. And what's fascinating about this new technology is we're returning almost to a Socratic model, because these mushy brains that exist in our skull have evolved to engage in dialogue, not to sit in a classroom for 7 hours a day and watch a blackboard. Nothing cognitively suggests that that's a remotely interesting model. It's a convenient model because you can do 1 on 30. So it's a sort of scaling model, one-to-many model. But that's only a matter of convenience. Ultimately, good teaching is one-to-one.
Yeah. And Ken Robinson talked 10 years or more ago in one of the most ever watched TED Talks about how we need to have competency-based learning.
Yeah.
So that all students master every part of a syllabus before moving on to the next part.
Correct.
Because what happens at the moment is the teachers can only go at a kind of average speed because they've got to deal with 30 students at the same time. And so lots of students miss chunks, and therefore whatever follows, they've got only a very shaky understanding of it.
Yeah.
Sadly, I know that happened to me when it came to maths. Between O-level and advanced O-level, my foundations crumbled. And so I watch with envy as David puzzles his way through advanced mathematical problems I just can't even get a grasp on. And hopefully, personalized AI tutors will stop that. When do you think we might have these things in classrooms so that that can happen?
Well, we've had them for some time, to be honest. This is why education is slow. It doesn't pick up on them very quickly. But we have these now with the new form of AI, so let's call it generative AI, these large language models. When ChatGPT was launched, very interestingly, it was launched with Khan Academy. I advise anyone who's interested in learning and teaching to go to the ChatGPT site and look at the Khan Academy video. Khan Academy has been around teaching primarily maths, but other subjects for a long time. And it does exactly what you mentioned there, Callum. If you get stuck, it gives you a mathematical problem. It will diagnose the mistake. The example they show right at the beginning is balancing an equation. If you don't balance it and get the signs, plus and minus, right, if you put a minus instead of a plus, it knows you've made that mistake, gives you feedback. But importantly, as you rightly said, Callum, doesn't take you on unless you've completed or become competent in that step. This is really important in mathematics. I've taught maths. It's important because mathematics is a very odd subject. If you have a catastrophic failure, you will learn absolutely nothing in maths from that point onwards.
Yeah.
It is an area of mass catastrophic failure because it's a difficult subject to teach and learn. When you're teaching one-to-many in a classroom, you cannot diagnose the problems everyone is having. Even if you add two-digit numbers together, there are up to about a dozen ways that can go wrong in the heads of the learner. Now imagine what that's like at the level of calculus.
Yeah.
So diagnosing what's going wrong is best done, actually, by this type of technology. The other interesting one I should add there is on languages, because the other thing that was launched was a partnership between Duolingo, which has over 100 million people using it, and it's a pure AI company, and that's now using these large language models to engage people in dialogue, which is exactly how we learn a language. Learning languages in British schools is an area of catastrophic failure, even worse than mathematics. Hundreds of thousands of kids today are learning Spanish, Italian, French, German. Hardly any of them will be able to order a cup of coffee at the end of years of instruction because you get no immersion, you get no practice, and that's where all the learning really takes place. Duolingo is offering role plays now.
So what's the evidence that this works? You quite rightly challenged some of the other learning theories and said, oh, it sounds nice from an armchair point of view. It didn't have the evidential backing.
Yeah.
So what is the evidence that this stuff gives you good answers rather than just plausible answers?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
Let's stick to the language learning one, for example. The empirical evidence is quite clear. You have 100 million, well, it's more than that, getting towards 150 million people in Duolingo learning up to 50 languages. And they, uniquely, unlike the schools, collect a huge amount of fine, granular detail on whether people have learned or not. They claim to get people to a B1 level in language, and people do achieve that. You can only get to that level in Duolingo by actually performing your competence in the language. Language is all about stopping forgetting. If you learn a second language, you forget most of the stuff you're trying to learn. Ebbinghaus, 1885, classic piece of science. It's been replicated many times. Now, what Duolingo do rather cleverly is have a half-life algorithm, which means that every single word you're trying to learn in a language, let's say Russian, which I've been looking at recently, if you have a phrase like "skажите, пожалуйста," then it knows how long you as an individual, David or Callum, will take to forget that. Then it desperately tries to stop you forgetting the phrase. That's the trick in language learning. That half-life algorithm, which is a very clever piece of AI, is a forgetting algorithm, and then they measure it. Of course, they measure it against the previous performance, and it's much, much better, so they build that into the system. You hardly ever get that in a schooling system because you're relying on individual teachers to improve their performance, and they tend to just plateau in performance.
I've used Duolingo. I'm forever on a mission to improve, or perhaps I should just say learn Spanish. And I found it very disappointing. It's a clever system. I like the way it gamifies it. You get your little gold stars and you get your owls when you've done well. But it tells you after a while that you're 50% fluent in Spanish, and you're nowhere near it. It's pretty good at learning vocabulary, but I'm not sure it teaches you much grammar.
Again, the empirical evidence would suggest otherwise. You have to persevere in streaks in the hundreds. People constantly underestimate how much effort you have to put in to learn a language. It's interesting, I had a friend who used to run a company, you may remember it, called Linguaphone. They used to be CDs in the back of the Times supplement.
Used it back at school, I think.
The interesting thing is, he had a great line. He said, I'm not selling language learning. I am selling the promise of learning a language to middle-class people who are going to Italy on their holidays and think they'll learn Italian. His point was that people think that learning a language is quite straightforward. They give up very quickly. It takes months, if not years, to become fluent in any of the second language. But the evidence would suggest from Duolingo that people do get to this B1 level, which is competence for basic job entry. Most people crap out, but most people crap out in school, in any other context, in language learning, because it's such a mountain to climb.
I've had a fairly recent and significant example of this, and it shows how much more difficult it becomes to learn languages as you get older. My son, who is now 21, he was a terrible linguist at school. He spent, 7 years learning French, and as you say, he couldn't order a cup of coffee by the end of it. And then he went to stay with some family in Chile, who, although they all speak English, they spoke Spanish a lot. And 6 weeks later, he came back speaking pretty good Spanish, which was remarkable.
Yeah.
And now he's fluent, which annoys the hell out of me because I'm really struggling. You mentioned that we already have these systems, but they're not yet good enough to be used routinely in school, are they? I don't think even in the most advanced educational environments like what we laughingly call public schools in the UK, and we mean private schools, where they have much better teacher-pupil ratios because there's a huge amount more money spent on them. They're not using AI tutors yet, are they? And it will happen. The really interesting question is, how long will it take before they are absolutely ready for prime time?
I don't think it's entirely true. Duolingo is used in schools by language teachers who are a bit more switched on, because they recognise that actually the effort to learn a language is in the hands of the learner. It's not something you teach from a lecture point of view, PowerPoint or something, which is why most of it fails, of course. Language is all about you speaking and writing the language. So Duolingo is starting to be quite widely used. But if you take Khan Academy has been trialled throughout a number of American schools, specifically in California, as we speak, because they're really trying to answer David's question, is there empirical evidence that it's efficacious? Quite clearly is to me. I've been through 4 years of this in an adaptive AI-driven system in America, in Arizona State University. The evidence is unequivocal in my view. If you go back to the Duolingo example, your Chilean example, they have put role play in where you can actually speak to the system as if it were another human being. And that's the great thing about Chat GPT. People stupidly type in a sentence and get a block of text and think that's it. No, it's a chat, it's a dialogue system. You keep going with it. It's also available in 95 languages, and the translation capabilities are fantastic. You can see where this is going very, very quickly. I'll be in Africa next week, in Senegal. We'll be doing a big workshop with people. I know it already works with 12 African languages. This has never been available in education before. Most education is rather oddly taught in the two big colonial languages, English and French. And this is a big problem in those places where you often have a pupil ratio of 1 to 50 with a poorly trained teacher and so on. If we imagine for a moment a thought experiment where you have a teacher that can teach any language, any subject, at any level, in a dialogue fashion, in an immersive fashion, stop when you have a problem, as we've just pointed out, overcome that problem so that we can logically move on in mathematics, statistics, whatever subject it is. What an amazing thing that would be, groundbreaking thing. What a massive impact it would necessarily have. I really like the article that Bill Gates wrote. He called it The Age of AI. He said the two big beneficiaries of this technology would be education and health. There's a parallel here with a physician. So when you go to your local GP, on average, they make about a 4.7% misdiagnosis rate. So call it 5% misdiagnosis. That's fairly standard in most health systems. Imagine if an AI system comes along and it only makes a 2% misdiagnosis rate. Why on earth would you want to go to your GP? So as soon as you pass these thresholds, and these are all threshold issues, not entirely, there's some social issues to do with school as well. But why would you want that? If you could get a degree online with the best tutor and a degree in artificial intelligence, why would you want to go to your local university? Most of the academics probably have a quite dated view of artificial intelligence and certainly don't have the skills to teach. I would defy anyone who went to university to say that they were taught by a masterful set of pedagogic experts, which is why 40% of people don't attend lectures at all, even in Harvard, where you pay $100,000 a year. So we're very quickly now, I say, on the horizon moving towards, it's already here, some of this stuff, and that's only in a few months. Imagine what it's going to be like in a few years. I think this is going to be a radical shift.
You mentioned the social aspect of schools and universities. Isn't it the case that what people learn in schools and universities is how to coexist, how to get on together, how to deal with personal interactions? So if people are learning at home via these systems, are they going to become less prepared for real-life interactions?
I think there are two separate things there. I am never been convinced by the idea that you learn social skills at university. Certainly not from academics, because they have a dearth of them. If you spent your whole life getting straight A marks, you've basically been in your back bedroom studying most of the time. The last person I would go for any social skills advice or a problem in life would be a professor of mathematics. Almost ridiculous idea. I think most of the lectures I had right through the whole system, Ivy League college, the whole lot, hardly any of them I would go to for advice in life or social issues.
But people learn from each other in these interactions.
Yeah, I mean, you're paying for rich kids to go and have a great time and drink a lot.
But also create great networks and also peer learning, as David says. Students learn a lot from each other, don't they?
I've been campaigning all my life for the other half of the population. What about the 50% of kids who don't go to university? What about them? They get ceremoniously dumped. We've stripped vocational learning out of the system. We've rewarded head knowledge workers enormously. You go into finance, make a lot of money. We suddenly found this stuff is interesting. OpenAI published a very interesting research paper showing that the jobs that are most at threat are the head workers now, because what it's doing is acquiring cognitive skills. Nobody thought this was going to happen. Everybody thought it was just people with what they called routine automated skills. In other words, working class people who lose their jobs. Of course, we don't have robots and we don't have self-driving cars, and we're not going to have waiters coming through restaurants as robots anytime soon.
But I've been making the joke for a good few years now in my talks that it doesn't really matter whether you're a barrister or a barista, because the AI is colorblind and it will take the job of the white-collar worker as much as the blue-collar worker. But latterly, everybody's waking up to that fact and it's scaling the bejesus out of people.
Going back to David's question about higher education, to stick to that one for a moment, is it right that society should spend so much money just taking half, the richest half of the population by and large, and mollycoddling their kids and giving them a sort of social club experience for 4 or 5 years where they can do nothing, not work and enjoy themselves, while the other half of the population get nothing? Because effectively that's what we've done over several generations. I think that's all wrong. I strongly recommend the book Case Against Education by Kaplan, who's an economist. You forget most of what you learn at university, and most of it's signalling. In other words, you have a stamp on your, like I went to an Ivy League in the US. That's great for me. You know, I can put that stamp on any piece of paper and it goes, oh, Donald, yeah, he went to an Ivy League. Wow.
Yeah, credentialing.
But that's not right. That's signalling. It doesn't say anything about my competence for any job. There's a very good book by David Goodhart on this called Head, Heart and Hand. So we've rewarded head, but look at people who work with their heart, people who look after our elderly relatives or the kids who look after your kids while you go to a senior management job in a school, and they're all on minimum wage. Or look at the people who work with their hands who, while we were sitting at home during COVID watching Netflix and reading, they were delivering food to us, they were the nurses, the people who were working hard, picking up the rubbish, keeping the world turning. I think we have had a social situation here that has, in a sense, been stretching inequalities. We know that's empirically true.
So maybe personalized tutors, thanks to AI, can get everybody over the humps as they're learning maths, as they're learning languages, as they're learning English or whatever language they speak in.
Yeah.
And can get either everybody into university or everybody to an equivalent level. It's a very exciting proposition and we need it to happen as soon as possible. And I'm very excited. The outcomes will be far, far better education than any of us have had. And the people who come out the other side will be really very interesting. I'm fascinated by when it could happen. As you say, GPT-4 is a sort of rudimentary version of it, because you can, and people should, have conversations with it and get it to teach them things. Of course, you've got to be careful of the things it hallucinates and mistakes it makes, which it still does. But it's definitely quite a long way along the road, but it's not there yet. And as I say, I don't think it's being deployed in any part of the education system full on. Yes, Khan Academy is valuable. Yes, Duolingo does what it does. But I wonder how long it will be until we have, effectively, everybody becomes Alexander the Great with their own Aristotle.
Of course, it's only been out since March.
Yeah.
So the expectation that it would be used in education would be a tough one. But of course it is, because every single kid on the planet and student is using it. And there are already papers being published showing almost universal use of it in terms of any writing task. You said something earlier, though, I thought was odd. Well, not odd, but I don't think this is all about getting kids to university at all. I think this is about not getting kids to university.
I didn't mean necessarily university, but just a more extended education.
Yeah, more extended education.
Which shouldn't stop at university. It should go on for your whole life.
That's correct, yeah. Let's talk about its limitations as well, though. These large language models are interesting. They're interesting because they can actually replace most of the theoretical education that we're talking about. Basically, we send kids for 20 years to do very little other than read and write text. It's a very text-based system. The essay is the normal pedagogic technique, the lecture, which is text-ridden or spoken. It's a rather odd, that, isn't it? From 4 or 5 up to now, you have to have a master's degree as well. You have to write even more essays and another dissertation. So this idea, I think, is just bloated and overworked. Employers are groaning at the ridiculousness of this idea that you never work, you don't have to have a job, even paper rounds have gone. Actually, you go back to David's question on socialisation. I think most students are not socialised. They don't meet any working class people. They're wholly surrounded by people like them. And they're quite surprised when they have to encounter people from another class or another culture when they come out. I used to hire lots of people from my 2 local universities. I was absolutely amazed that some of them had never worked before. Not even in a bar, no paper round, nothing. But they had a sort of entitlement that they knew about the world, which they clearly didn't. Coming back to limitations, large language models are quite texty in a sense and theoretical. And that's because the AI itself has no sense of time and action. It doesn't work like the human brain in that way. Time is not a factor, action is not a factor. The world, it doesn't have a world model, doesn't have the senses that a human being has. So we'll quickly, this is already happening of course, we'll quickly see the large language model, generative AI model, move into an ensemble of tools within AI that build in, first of all, memory. So we have a working memory and a long-term memory. These large language models, ChatGPT, has a limited sort of buffer, really, on dialogue, but not much memory. That is, as we speak, being added. The second one is a sort of world view, which is this notion of a 3D world in which we exist, and time, so that it can actually make decisions about what you might do in a job. For example, I'm stuck doing this in this context, what do I do next? And then there's also provenance. Where did this information come from? Because large language models are intrinsically probabilistic models which spit out words. There's no guarantee of their correspondence with truth. The idea of a truth machine is a ridiculous idea anyway. In epistemology, there is no such thing as absolute truth. There's a whole load of stuff around the edge that's opinion, incorrigible knowledge, and so on. Nevertheless, the provenance, if it says something, how do we know it's right? Well, as Google and Bard and Bing and other systems are already doing, you have a side check, as it were, a sidekick check back to Google Scholar, let's say on citations, or Google generally, or other sources of knowledge like Wikipedia or whatever.
Yeah.
And then we can solve the provenance problem. Accuracy is another separate thing. And again, that's another issue that you may want to follow on going forward there as well. That was my dog, by the way.
Hello, dog. That was a really interesting description of what GPT-4, for instance, would need to add in order to become an Aristotle.
Yeah.
The memory, the worldview, and as a shorthand, fact-checking.
That's right.
The worldview in particular is a really big deal. If you give an AI a worldview, you're not much short, I would think, at that point, of artificial general intelligence.
Yes, that's right.
Which suggests that actually there's a long way to go before we've got really good personalized tutors ready for education.
I claim that GPT-4 has got a theory of physics much more than GPT 3.5.
It does, yeah.
You type in a particular puzzle about you do this and you do this, what's going to happen next. It can't work it out just from the syntax. It needs to know facts about the real world. GPT 3.5 often gets it wrong. GPT-4 surprisingly often gets it right.
That's correct.
Does it have it a priori, or does it work it out each case as you present it? If you give it a problem, what happens if I throw this ball in the air? It sort of figures out its worldview about that bit of physics, or does it have a worked out common sense view of the world before? I don't think it does it?
No, it doesn't have that. It's an interesting comparison, 3 and 4 here. If we take physics as an example, what they've done is pushed the parameter number up. Now, they haven't actually told us what the increase, the order of magnitude increase is from 3.5 to 4, but it's considerable. And it would seem that just by increasing the magnitude of the parameters, you get significant improvements, even in things like physics, because language embodies physics, if you see what I mean. If you're capturing all physics textbooks in the world, for example, then you get more physics knowledge. But it's not as if it has a world view of physics. It doesn't really work like that. All these individual words are tokens, technically, which could be numbers and all sorts of things. The parameters are the relationships between any two words, like dog and puppy or dog and leaf.
Parameter being like a synapse in a human brain.
That's right. Now, What people like Gary Marcus and Jan LeCun are saying, Jan LeCun, one of the three people who got the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in AI, is there are certain natural limits to this, which is why I was talking about these ensembles. And what they are saying is you really do have to introduce, one is that concept of inference, which is more to do with mathematics and physics. You know, that notion that you go through deduction or even induction to come to a conclusion. Many people are working on that, the inference side of AI, and that will be folded into this ensemble. That's one way of doing it. This worldview thing is interesting because our brains are actually sort of evolved to deal with a 3D. We have a spatial sense, we have inbuilt physics. Some of it is plainly wrong, which is why we thought the sun went around the earth, for example. Nevertheless, we have an inbuilt spatial sensibility in 3D. But it's not that you should feed your worldview to the model. The model has to learn the world as it is. Now, there are a couple of big researchers here, David Ha and Friston, who are looking at this. It's not that you feed it the worldview, you use sensory input to it so that it creates its own worldview, if that makes sense. These large language models are a bit brittle with regard to accuracy on the fringe, mostly right. Big core stuff in the middle for most teaching, certainly in schools, even undergraduate level, is going to be pretty solid. But if we really want to move it to AGI, then this worldview, memory, the sense of real world time, movement, action, observation, the empirical side.
It's a very interesting question about a lot of advanced AI. How close do you have to get to AGI to have a really good working system? People recently have been saying that self-driving cars looks like an AI complete problem, i.e. you need pretty much AGI in order to be able to have self-driving cars. I've never been convinced by that, and it's looking increasingly like it's not true because Cruise and Waymo are making pretty good progress and they're starting to roll their systems out. But maybe with personalized tutors, you actually can't have your automated Aristotle without having something pretty close to AGI. It'll be very interesting to find out.
I've become less enamored with the AGI debate. It's very difficult to pin down what this AGI is, as if there was one sort of benchmark, which is human intelligence. And what is human intelligence? It's hugely variable.
We probably actually ought to say what the acronym means, because we're always at risk of throwing it around without explaining it. AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. I think it just means a pretty vague but perfectly reasonable threshold of a machine is an AGI once it is able to do everything that an adult human can do cognitively.
Yeah.
And it will already at that point be superhuman in many areas, but when it overtakes the last thing that we can do, which it couldn't previously do, that's when you've got AGI. But then, of course, you're straight into superintelligence, which is another whole kettle of fish.
I think there's a danger in this human exceptionalism around all this stuff. Copernicus threw us back away from being the centre of the universe on a little rock that's just hurtling around the sun. And then Darwin were just another animal. And then, of course, physically, technology has trounced us for years. It was once thought that if we travelled in a train, we'd go so fast we would die. And, of course, we learned how to fly in 1906, and within 66 years we had landed on the moon. These are all transhuman phenomena in the sense, that physically technology has trounced us every time. I think when we look at this new form of AI, it will certainly trounce what managers, consultants, researchers can do quite quickly, even as we discussed already, teachers, doctors, let's say. Is there anything left here that's interesting cognitively? Well, there's loads. The brain is a remarkably poor organ for all sorts of cognitive tasks. It sleeps 8 hours a day. It dies. It gets dementia, Alzheimer's. It gets depressed. It's inattentive. And we forget almost everything. You try and teach it. That's why kids have to spend 20 years in the education system, because they're always forgetting stuff. And I'm not too sure that AGI, the human benchmark, is such a useful thing now.
I think it's quite useful if you're a human. I completely agree. We don't want to be anthropocentric enough to think that our particular level of intelligence is the only important one in the universe. There are undoubtedly enormous distances you can go beyond us, but we happen to be human. So when something overtakes us is quite important, because us becoming the chimpanzees of the world, the second smartest species on the planet, that's an important moment.
It will also mean that there are no jobs left for humans to do, because whatever we thought we were special in doing, there will be systems that are better, cheaper, less tired than we do.
Yeah.
So that's a change to the economy as well.
One of the interesting things about these large language models in relation to the word intelligence, you have to be always careful with these big abstract nouns. One of the things that large language models have shown us is that language is really essential for intelligence. That's what surprised us about chat, that it can do so much just because all it is language, tokens. and it's only been trained in language, nothing else. And it would seem as though intelligence is much more intimately connected with language than we had previously thought. It's not that language is something that comes from intelligence. It looks as though language is the thing that creates intelligence itself. This is very interesting. This means you can push out the large language model on its own quite far to capture this idea of AGI, or general human intelligence, because it would seem as though most of the intelligent things we do involve language. Nevertheless, there are other things in terms of human exceptionalism. People have taken refuge in 21st century skills, and they all begin with C: collaboration,
creativity, compassion.
How could the real world be so illiterate?
Yeah, God likes C's.
The C words, education loves them. Nevertheless, I think that's mistaken. I think actually they're the things that are most under threat. The debate around creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration, they may be the last stands, the sort of Custer's last stands at Little Bighorn on cognitive skills. Actually, they're the things that will be eaten at most quickly, I suspect. And therefore, what are we left with? We're left with being human. We're suddenly seeing the transcendent. This is why this is a far bigger deal than education.
Well, at the moment, we're left with one other big C word, which is consciousness. We think, we've got no evidence to believe that machines are conscious yet.
Yeah.
And until they are, we think that gives us an extra dimension of value.
Well, that's a very good question. It then begs the question as to what role consciousness has in intelligence. AI, by and large, is competent without comprehension. It can beat you at any game, but it doesn't know it's won. There's no sense of self-identity. It's just a big amorphous mass of maths and software. Nevertheless, consciousness is an interesting phenomenon. If you're Daniel Dennett, you think it's just an epiphenomenon. It's just like an internal theta, and it doesn't actually play much role in what you do. But others think that it has a really important executive function in controlling what you do as an essential part of you as an individual. But AI doesn't have that, in a sense. This is why Geoffrey Hinton resigned from Google recently. He made the very interesting point that if one area of the AI system learns, the whole system learns instantaneously. We as individual evolved units have our own individual solipsistic form of consciousness. AI doesn't really have that in any sense. It's not a sense of atomistic entities. These are large, huge networks.
So an AI system or a collection of AIs would inevitably be hive minds because they can communicate a whole Library of Congress worth of ideas instantaneously in a way that we can't.
Yes, that's right.
I wish we could. It would be brilliant to be able to learn French just by porting it a la the Matrix.
That's absolutely right. So Geoffrey Hinton's point there is that it's so fast it's instantaneous, that the hive mind becomes very good very quickly.
Which is why we have to think about it now, before this hive mind exists.
Yeah.
Because it won't just suddenly appear in one place and we can isolate it. It'll be everywhere.
Yes. There are various attitudes towards this. When we discuss the ethical issues or how we're going to deal with this problem, which is an ethical issue, but it's also a sort of practical issue, I think there are really three camps here. The first camp are people like Jan LeCun, who I mentioned, even Geoffrey Hinton, to be honest, and Altman, who's the chief exec of OpenAI, Suskever, who works there, Bill Gates, Lanier, all sorts of people. They think we should proceed here, but with caution. I think that's fair. Proceed with caution. Make sure regulatory control comes in a timely fashion. There are those, the famous letter that came out from the Future of Life Institute, run by a guy called Tegmark. The third group is those who want to ban it completely. Yudkowsky is the most famous example. Those are the three camps.
The motivation of all three is good. I don't think any of them are doing it for personal vanity or for publicity or even to make money. They all deeply want to see a better world with AI serving humanity. They're just afraid in different ways as to what may happen if we misconfigure it, if we connect it together on the wrong way.
Yeah, honest differences of opinion, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's very important that we have this diversity of opinion. Going back to the middle point, the plurality of the debate and discussion will result in a much better solution in the end. I wholly agree with that. But there has been some irrational stuff. For example, Italy banning it and then having to relent, of course, because they found that productivity amongst coders was plummeting. And of course, Brussels phoned them up and said, "What are you doing?" It's not quite as simple as a debate. You also have the issue of investment and where it grows and where it doesn't grow. So when Italy banned ChatGPT, every investor in Europe went, well, why would we put any money into Italy? And actually, they went one step further. People are going, why would you invest in a European country? Why would you put money in the EU if one of the member states has already banned it? They work on risk and reward. So it can freeze investment and freeze research. I think Europe's lost the game on AI anyway. It's now primarily a US concern. But the debate is important. There's no doubt about that. Then it swings over into the regulation. Everyone's an amateur armchair ethicist now, of course. But it's a complex business needing a lot of expertise, and there are some very good groups of expertise. I'm aligned with the UK and the US on this in not rushing towards premature legislation. A good example was the EU's GDPR stuff, which gave us all those consent pop-ups. I don't know about you, but I never read a consent form. That is a bad solution to a problem, a massive hit on productivity.
I don't know whether I'm a fan of GDPR or not, to be honest, but I do know that there is another big impact of GDPR, which often goes neglected, which is that it's enabled the Commission to fine American tech giants with enormous amounts of money.
Yeah.
Meta just today is being fined over €1 billion for sending European data to America. That's a much bigger deal than a few pop-ups saying, do you allow these cookies?
Oh, yeah. I certainly wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and the bath. In fact, some of the EU legislation on their 4 levels, for example, of unacceptable, high, limited and minimum entities, so you don't actually crush small research companies with limited reach on data rules, but you might want to hit the big tech giants. And I think that's an enlightened view. The EU documentation has been written since 2018. They've been working hard on this for many years. It will come into law in 2024. My fear is that people like Italy and some of the more radical elements will come in and do a sort of pop-up consent form type stuff and therefore shrink and control investment and progress in AI in Europe. We're already miles behind. That would be a shame. Like genetic modification of crops, I personally think that's been a disaster for Europe.
Me too.
Yep.
The US and the UK, I think, have a fairly enlightened view. They've said, we have a common law view of the world, so we don't want to freeze everything and make it absolute rules. You have case law that moves forward. I think that's the right way to deal with this. The US and the UK are roughly aligned on safety, discrimination, privacy, opt-out notices, all that sort of stuff, because they speak to each other. Then you have China. The trouble with the EU is sometimes the EU think they're the king of the world, but it's only 5.7% of the world's population. It's nothing really. And the idea that they're going to control this agenda, I think, is completely mistaken. I think the US will control it primarily, and then China will have a huge role. And Chinese, I had a real deep dive into Chinese legislation in this, and I think it's quite interesting because there's some really good stuff in there.
We're touching on so many big topics, but I'd like to just briefly move away from the future of humanity or even the future of geopolitics. I wonder if we can just get you to offer an opinion on the future of the education industry. Callum mentioned in the beginning, some edtech companies have had a share price hit. The companies that you are overseeing, are they taking advantage of this technology, or will they be left behind and disrupted terribly?
Oh, I think lots of companies will be disrupted terribly by it because it's such a massive increase in productivity. Something that took a day takes minutes, seconds. But this will be generally, in economic terms, a massive boost on productivity. That will come through very quickly in the system, and that's a good thing for all of us because whatever education or health system we want, we should be able to afford it if the productivity increases come through as promised. So we forget about that causality sometimes.
We shouldn't worry just about people not being able to get jobs at such high salaries. We should say, hey, everybody's going to get education for free, or almost for free.
Well, that's right. There's the jobs issue. Now, that is a political issue and a serious one that people should be addressing. Interestingly, the person who's given it most thought is Sam Altman. Sam Altman's spent millions on research into basic universal income. BUI has been around for a while, but nobody's taken it that seriously. But I think it will be taken more seriously over the next few years because it's a very real hypothesis and prospect. But coming back to David's question about the educational systems, we've had falling enrollment in universities in the US for 12 consecutive years. Many of them are going out of business because it's bloated, it's too expensive, and it's being perceived as not worth it by huge swathes of the population now. Now, that's a shocking statistic. Nobody knows this because they're scared of admitting it, I think. So you're seeing an education system that's bloated, far too expensive, and works on scarcity and exclusivity. Higher education is an incredibly elitist thing in a way. We will limit it If an Oxbridge education is so good, why don't we open it up to everyone?
Maybe the personalized AI tutors will do exactly that. It's a tutorial system for everybody.
Well, that's right. My guess is that it will go in the direction, I've always believed this, that it will go in the direction of Khan Academy, universal tutors in specific subjects or domains, or Duolingos in language. In language learning, for example, which is a huge business globally, especially learning English. Let's focus on that example. You already have companies in South Korea like Speak, where you're literally speaking the language to your screen and you're speaking to an avatar effectively that speaks back to you and corrects your pronunciation and does all that stuff using these large language models. This is a revolution. It's like a huge order of magnitude greater in terms of the efficacy of the teaching. As I say, I think it's better than your GP in terms of misdiagnosis. If it becomes better than your average teacher, why wouldn't we do this? I'll be in Senegal next week, and I would hope that this is a boon for the Southern Hemisphere. We talk a lot about university. Hardly anybody in Africa goes to university. Perhaps we should be looking at this globally.
Well, maybe AI will help those countries leapfrog the West, as they have done in some other ways, like with M-Pesa and mobile phones, and maybe that is the way forward. Donald, we've gone way over time because it's been such a fascinating conversation and you've got so many interesting ideas. You're like a Catherine wheel of ideas, spinning them off in fireworks. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great session.
It's been a pleasure, guys. That was interesting. We managed to take a deep dive into 2 or 3 topics there, but on a very, very big subject.
Very big subject, yeah.